This video is brought to you by Captivating History. Wars may be fought with weapons, but they are won by men. It is the spirit of the men who follow and the man who leads that gains the victory. George Patton. Born on November 11, 1885, George was the son of a wealthy rancher and district attorney near Pasadena, California. Growing up on the ranch, young George knew a life of comfort, joyous play, and stability. George's greatest struggle during this time was definitely his difficulty in learning to read and write. Until the age of 11, he was tutored at home. However, he would only learn this skill later in school as a teenager. Perhaps this is the first battle that George Patton ever had to fight, the struggle for a simple, everyday skill. But like the bigger battles he would fight later in his life, it was a battle that he won. Historians have since speculated that George suffered from dyslexia. Apart from his difficulty with learning to read, George is recorded as having an almost idyllic childhood. Growing up with his parents, aunt and younger sister Nita, he was always aware of his upper-class status. Despite living in California, his family had a very southern brand of snobbery, which they passed on to George by their stories of his ancestors' exploits. He also enjoyed a close relationship with his father, George Smith Patton Sr. His father told him endless stories about the military exploits and courage of his ancestors in many different wars, including the Civil War and the struggle for Scottish independence. In 1897, George was sent to Stephen Clark's School for Boys, a prestigious establishment exclusively for upper-class young men like himself. It seemed that this school would provide the motivation George needed to overcome his learning difficulty and learn at last to read. This opened a door that had long been barred to him. Even though reading would still have been difficult for him, now at least it was possible, and George began to read voraciously, staying along the lines as the material his father had read to him at home. He adored reading about the adventures of military heroes as varied as Joan of Arc, Julius Caesar, and Hannibal. As a result, his marks in both ancient and military history were high. Unfortunately for George, his newfound ability to read did not spell the end of his academic struggle, as dyslexia doesn't involve just reading. His father made a mighty effort to get George accepted into West Point, but his poor academic performance made all his father's politics useless when both Pattons realized that failing the entrance exam was practically guaranteed. Instead, he attended the Virginia Military Institute for a year in 1903 to 1904. Leaving home for VMI was hardly an adjustment at all. For one thing, his family continued to spoil George rotten. And besides, there was plenty to occupy his attention. George particularly enjoyed marching on the parade ground and doing other military exercises. He also threw himself into sports, especially football. George's social life was the only thing that seemed to be a little lacking. Apart from his growing relationship with a pretty young lady, he had few friends at school. The other boys found him pompous and self-important, something which George was conscious and proud of. He had a strong sense of his proud heritage and his relation to the Southern gentry, which added a hint of racism to his already strong personality. This didn't appear to bother him much. He wrote to his father that the other boys were nice fellows, but very few of them were born gentlemen, and he considered those of lesser birth rather beneath him. This regrettable tendency likely evolved as a result of the family-proud influence of his parents, but it's fair to say that a certain amount of arrogance was part of George's character. His confidence made him unstoppable in war. It also alienated him in school. Above all, George threw himself into his studies with a newfound fervency. He wanted nothing more than to become an outstanding soldier, and he knew that he would only receive the very best education at West Point. And for West Point, he needed academic success. He worked harder than ever before, and, well supported by his family, his grades began to gradually climb. In 1904, this was good enough for California's senator to nominate him for West Point, an unorthodox method of gaining entry, but one that George was all too happy to take. He immediately began to shine in military drills and played sports with reckless, impulsive courage that would eventually typify him as an adult. Football was an unmitigated disaster. George's tenacity and reckless courage got him injured more than once, until finally he was persuaded to take up fencing and track and field instead. Fencing, in particular, would go on to shape a large part of his later life. But when it came to his academic performance, George grew complacent. He slacked off during his plebe year at West Point, and this cost him dearly when he failed mathematics at the end of the year. For arrogant George, this must have been a terrible blow. All those peers of his who were not born gentlemen were able to carry on with their studies, while George had to repeat an entire year. That was a mistake that he never made again. When he graduated in 1909, now cadet adjutant, the second highest position in the academy, George S. Patton, the boy who couldn't read, was academically ranked 46th out of 103. He was now officially ready to become a soldier. Throughout his life, George would be known for being ruthless, fearless, arrogant, and insensitive. But he was not heartless, and nobody knew that better than Beatrice Banning Eyre. In 1910, George married Beatrice, who was also from an upper-class family. But George hadn't rushed this decision, as they had courted for 8 years before that. In March 1911, Beatrice gave birth to their first child, a healthy little girl, Beatrice Eyre Patton. After the birth of little B, George was transferred to Fort Myer, Virginia, where he was quartermaster for his troop. Many of the Army's senior command was also stationed there. With his keen nose for the upper class, it didn't take George long to fraternize with them. He particularly made friends with the Secretary of War, Henry L. Stimson, and became his aide at social events. George didn't spend his entire time at Fort Myer solely on military ventures, though. His skills with running, fencing, and riding quickly caught the attention of his commanders, and he was selected to represent the United States in modern pentathlon at the 1912 Stockholm Olympics. The traditional pentathlon was comprised of a foot race, discus throw, javelin throw, long jump, and wrestling. These were all skills that would have been essential for a soldier of that era. George's performance in the 1912 Olympics was not his last excursion into sports. In fact, for the next 3 years, he would go on to study fencing extensively. First traveling to Saumur, France with his family, he spent some time learning more about the art of fencing from Adjutant Charles Clary. He brought his knowledge back to Fort Myer and began to suggest a change in the fighting style of the cavalry. Instead of using curved sabers to cut and slash, George suggested a more aggressive thrusting technique. He was assigned to the office of the Chief of Staff of the Army, and there designed a sword of his own. The model 1913 cavalry saber, commonly known as the Patton saber, would be the last cavalry saber the United States military ever issued. George would return to Saumur for further instruction before being sent to Fort Riley, Kansas in 1913, where he joined the Mounted Service School. His adept skill with both swordsmanship and riding soon made him Master of the Sword, the first Army instructor to carry that title. He was both student and teacher at the school and graduated in 1950. Sadly, this was the end of George's sports career. While he was selected for the 1916 Olympics, they were canceled due to World War I, which George probably considered an even better challenge. It was during the Border War of 1910 to 1919 that George would have his first taste of real combat. The mustachioed revolutionary Francisco Pancho Villa had led a disastrous hit-and-run attack on the small American town of Columbus, New Mexico. Torching the buildings and ransacking all he could, Villa's men left 18 Americans dead, 8 soldiers and 10 civilians, including a pregnant woman. Incensed, the American Army responded by launching the Pancho Villa Expedition. This excursion into Mexico to track down and capture their villainous enemy would last 9 months and ultimately prove unsuccessful, but it did provide the then 31-year-old George with his first battle. His snobbish pride turned into a kind of swashbuckling swagger, evidenced when he started shoving his .45 Colt into his belt instead of stooping to the apparent weakness of a holster. This nearly caused something of a disaster one night in a saloon, ending with one smoking hole in the floorboards and another in his pants. Miraculously, there was not a mark on his body. After a month into his duty as John J. Pershing's aide, George approached the commander begging for the opportunity to command a troop. He was given Troop C of the 13th Cavalry. Eager for blood, George led his troop in the manhunt for more Villistas, hoping to find Pancho himself. But the fight would turn out to find them. It was by accident that George ended up stumbling upon a ranch belonging to an important Villista army leader, Julio Cardenas. While cars had never been used in any form of military combat before, George absolutely did not hesitate to use this unconventional method of attack. Pushing his 3 dodges to the limit, he and his men rushed upon the ranch. Cardenas and 2 of his guards opened fire on George and his men. Exhilarated to be in the battle at last, George gleefully returned fire with his ivory Colt peacemakers and wounded all 3 of them. It was unclear who exactly fired the fatal shots in the end, but the results were the same. Cardenas and his guards were dead, and not one of George's soldiers were lost. In 1917, George headed off to Europe for his first taste of a world war, and on November 10th of that year, George was given the assignment to teach his fellow Americans how to drive tanks. In August 1918, George was given command over the 1st Tank Battalion and sent along with the rest of the Tank Corps to the railroad through Saint-Mihiel to Verdun in France. September 12, 1918 would be George's first taste of a world war. He waited in his tank behind the front lines, listening to the shelling. At first, he was nervous about sticking his head out of the parapet, but within a few hours of the fight starting, George was bored of waiting. He climbed out of the tank and headed into the thick of battle on foot. This day would be one of the best in George's life. Reckless, dangerous, characterized by rash decisions, and endlessly exciting. He marched fearlessly across a bridge that was presumed to be mined. It wasn't. Hitched a ride on random tanks that he came across, and spent a few hours hiding in an open shell hole, a hole blown in the earth by an explosive shell, after diving off a tank that was being violently fired on. He escaped the shell hole by traveling across the battlefield, listening for the sounds of the machine guns and throwing himself to the ground anytime he heard the machine guns open. He described his calculation of the time between the guns opening and the bullets arriving as the only use I know of that math has ever been to me. He returned to his ranks later that afternoon to happily organize an attack on a small town called Benet. The next day, Patton adopted what would be his characteristic method of leadership, leading from the front. Walking in front of his tanks as an inspiring example to his men, he led his troops to victory, capturing Joinville on September 14th. 12 days later, Patton got seriously wounded during the Meuse-Argonne offensive in France. This meant the end of World War I for him. From 1919 to 1937, George didn't see much action, except when he saved 3 boys from drowning. After relinquishing command on his tank brigade in 1920, he was sent to Fort Myer to work as a staff officer. During this time, he bounced from post to post, now Hawaii, now Boston, now Washington, D.C., never finding satisfaction, never finding war. America's involvement in World War II began famously and decisively with the Japanese attack on Hawaii that George had so chillingly predicted in his paper Surprise, Pearl Harbor. On 7 December 1941, Japanese aircraft bombed the Hawaiian city, killing more than 2,000 Americans. While the United States had been lending some support to the Allies in the form of money and war materials before then, Pearl Harbor was the last straw that broke America's neutrality. War was declared, and American troops were shipped out to the front lines in Europe, Asia, and North Africa. The latter force was led by none other than George Patton. George's face was well practiced in expressing disdain. The corners of his mouth pulled down as he walked into the headquarters of II Corps, surveying the scene before him with disgust. Soldiers wandered around the base wearing only half their uniforms, their helmet straps swinging loose if they were wearing helmets at all, and watching him with a kind of weary boredom rather than drawing themselves to attention to salute George, who was now a lieutenant general. Glancing into the bunks, George spotted unmade beds and dirty clothes scattered along the floor. The current commander, Major General Lloyd Friedendahl, was not in his office. George finally found him at breakfast. it was 10 in the morning. It was March 6, 1943. The American Army just had its first real clash with the Axis in the Battle of Kasserine, where General Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had crushed the Allies in a resounding defeat that had cost them some 50 miles and 5,000 lives. Friedendahl had watched from safety behind the lines as his men were slaughtered, and Dwight D. Eisenhower, now Supreme Allied Commander, had had enough. After sending Major General Omar Bradley to inspect the corps and find out that Friedendahl's men had all lost confidence in him after seeing their comrades so freely killed, Eisenhower concluded that there was no way around it. Friedendahl had to be replaced. By this point, George was an obvious choice. He had made his debut as Major General in 1942 when, putting himself on the front lines as he always did, he helped to plan Operation Torch. This was the invasion of French North Africa, attacking the might of the Germans from a new front. George's first taste of the Second World War was a spectacular one. With 35,000 men in a convoy of 100 ships, he landed on the coast of Morocco and set his sights on Casablanca. The Vichy French resisted him strenuously, but it was no good. George was unstoppable, and he led his men to a resounding victory only 3 days after landing. Casablanca was theirs, and he converted it into a military port, later hosting the Casablanca Conference in 1943. On March 17th, George's unflinching attitude and Eisenhower's decision to place him in command would pay off. He led his men in an attack on Gafsa, whose success eventually led to an Allied victory in the Battle of El Ghetar. They didn't stop there. George was determined to push on, resisting the higher command who were considering sidelining the American troops after their disgraceful performance at Kasserine. Ruthlessly rooting out commanders whose performance was anything but stellar, George continued to champion the American Army and persuade the higher command that they were capable of more. Part of George's hands-on leadership style was visiting field hospitals to pay his respects to the men who had been wounded underneath his leadership. His attitude to the dead and wounded was not one of guilt. "It is foolish and wrong to mourn the men who died," he would say later. "Rather, we should thank God such men lived." However, he was still compelled to visit the hospitals and check on the thousands of men who were injured in battle. Identified in World War I as shell shock, battle fatigue is known today as combat stress reaction. While soldiers suffering from the disorder looked utterly unscathed, they were utterly incapable of fighting, and not only because their emotions did not allow it. One time, George stopped at a field hospital in Nicosia, as was his custom. It was in the supply room there that he came across Charles Kuhl, an 18-year-old private who had been evacuated as suffering from battle fatigue. He was immediately skeptical when he spotted the apparently unhurt young man sitting on a crate there, his 1,000-yard stare characteristic of the disorder. Approaching him, George demanded to know what the matter with him was. Kuhl's answer could not have been more infuriating. "I guess I can't take it." George snapped. Grasping the teenager by the front of his shirt, he yanked him to his feet and applied an almighty slap to his youthful face, ranting about cowardice. Kuhl, apparently unhurt, fled the tent, sped up by George's boot to his behind. George was enraged by the prevalence of battle fatigue among the troops. With 40% of medical discharges being attributed to psychiatric disorders, it was no surprise that he was seeing thousands of his men sidelined by what he perceived as their unwillingness to risk their lives for their country. Incensed on behalf of the men who were left behind, he issued orders to his men to forbid any of their troops from being evacuated for battle fatigue. This was still not enough for George, however. Only a week later, he slapped 21-year-old Paul Bennett, who admitted to the general that he was hospitalized because he just couldn't take it anymore. George did this in front of the wrong people, though. The ranking surgeon of the hospital sent a report of George's behavior to Eisenhower, who personally rebuked George only days later. While Eisenhower recognized that George was too valuable to the war to be fired, an option that was seriously considered, he knew that George's behavior had been unacceptable. He ordered the general to apologize to the men he had slapped and to the rest of the army. Surprisingly, George demurred. He apologized to every single division in his command, as well as personally meeting with Cool and Bennett to apologize to them personally. But that was not the end of it. Later in the year, the American press got wind of the debacle. The story spread like wildfire, and George was condemned by the public for being a despicable tyrant. Perhaps most painfully, Pershing, George's first commander, loudly expressed his disdain for his former protege's behavior. Eisenhower had no choice but to move George to the sidelines. For nearly 11 months, George was to have no frontline duties. It was only in January 1944 that George would be given command again, this time over the Third Army, a band of inexperienced soldiers who had just arrived in England. George was sent to the Western Front, attacking towards Brittany and the Seine, instead of in the thick of the fighting at Normandy. But he was not discouraged by the commanders who still failed to take him as seriously as he wanted. Pushing his men harder and faster than anyone could have anticipated, George punched through the German resistance, trapping a giant chunk of their army in the Falaise Pocket. This pocket would turn out to be the key point of the Allies' victory at the Battle of Normandy. George used a winning combination of brains and brawn to effect his victories, sending scouts ahead of his ever-reliable tanks, using light aircraft for reconnaissance, and making extensive use of excellent radio communications. George sent his men forward intelligently. But where he sent them, he expected nothing less than fearlessness and aggressive fighting. They pushed the Germans into a retreat that grew all the more disorganized as they crumbled under the unrelenting pressure of the American troops. Finally, on the 1st of August, American bombers blew a hole in the German line. Allied troops rushed into the pocket, and the German 7th Army was scattered into disarray and surrender. The Third Army wasn't finished yet. They were on fire, their commander leading the way as they continued to charge through Germany, plowing through all that dared to stand against them. In early 1945, the Germans found themselves in full retreat, with George relentlessly on their heels. The Third Army's work was almost done. It was the end of March 1945. There was almost no resistance left as the army continued to move through Germany. But there was one more mission that George was determined to launch. Oflag 13B was a prisoner of war camp about 50 miles into enemy territory. The brutal camp was home to about 500 officers in terrible conditions, with temperatures in the barracks being about 19 degrees Fahrenheit in the bitter winter and food being in scarce supply. They were suffering. And one of these was John K. Waters, a young man who had been languishing in the camp since he was captured in the Tunisia campaign in 1943. Most crucially, Waters had married Bea Patton, George's eldest daughter, in 1934. George was determined to set him free. On March 26, 1945, George sent a secret task force, Task Force Bomb, to liberate the prisoners of war. For once, his heart was leading him instead of his head, and the attack was a complete disaster. All 57 vehicles involved in the raid were lost. Most of the men of Task Force Bomb ended up interred in the camp themselves. Waters, in his attempts to contact the task force from inside the camp, was shot and badly wounded. George's attempt to save his son-in-law almost killed him. It also killed most of the task force. Of the 314 men who set out for Oflag 13B, only 35 returned. Even George would later admit that the attack was a grave mistake. But despite this, Waters did survive. He returned to America in 1946 to train cadets at West Point, the academy that had made his father-in-law. On December 9, 1945, the day before George was scheduled to go back home to the U.S., Major General Hobart Gay suggested to George that the two of them should spend the day hunting pheasants in the countryside. Gay had observed that George looked unhappy, and as his chief of staff, he felt compelled to cheer him up somehow. George was delighted with the idea. He wanted to spend his last day in Europe enjoying the countryside that he had always loved. The two men set off to Speyer, Bavaria, through the war-torn landscape with Private First Class Horace Woodring driving them in George's Cadillac. George sat in the back seat. He was unusually quiet as they rumbled through the countryside, staring at the scars the war had left there. Derelict cars lined the side of the road, with the occasional glimpse of a bombed-out house through the trees. Staring out the window, George murmured, "How awful war is. Think of the waste." Then, without warning, a U.S. Army truck swung in front of them in an attempt to turn into a quartermaster depot. Woodring stomped on the brakes as hard as he could, but the Cadillac slid and squealed across the road. It smashed into the truck. George was thrown forward, headfirst into the partition between the front and back seats. The steel sliced into his scalp, the impact shattering his neck. Paralyzed and struggling to breathe, George lay groaning, defeated at last by a simple car accident. George was taken to a hospital in Heidelberg and placed in full traction, an inexpressibly painful treatment that prompted him to groan out, "This is a hell of a way to die." B was flown in from America on December 11th. For the next 10 days, she did not leave his side as George slipped slowly away from her. Paralyzed from the neck down, he knew he would never live normally again. The general had long since stopped fighting. He did not fight his injuries either. At just before 6 in the evening on December 21, 1945, this man of war died peacefully in his sleep when both his heart and his lungs finally failed. But was it an accident? This would not be Douglas Bazzata's first killing. A member of the United States Office of Strategic Services, OSS, which would later become the famous CIA, Bazzata had been a spy and a leader of the fearless Jedburghs during the war. He parachuted into enemy territory in Belgium and France, among others, and as a Lebanese Jew, he had every reason to choose the Allied side. He was an expert marksman, a warrior who'd killed countless others in the war. But this was different. Bazzata watched the road, his rifle at the ready. He knew that General George Patton's car would soon come down that road, and he also knew that his plan was risky. He had an army truck at his disposal, one that would turn directly into Patton's car at just the right moment. And at that same moment, Bazzata would fire a rifle shot through the car window. He'd already prepared the window a few minutes earlier when the car stopped to admire a Roman ruin, and kill Old Blood and Guts without causing real harm to the other two occupants of the car. There was just one problem. Bazzata had faith in his marksmanship skills, although he didn't really trust the Polish man who was his accomplice in this assassination, so he was pretty sure he'd succeed in his mission. The catch was that he genuinely liked George Patton. The man hated Jews, sure, but his army had been instrumental in setting them free. He was a dynamic force of nature, and even though Wild Bill Donovan, the head of the OSS, had assured him that killing Patton would be saving him from himself, Bazzata wasn't so sure. But orders were orders, and money was money. He heard the sound of two engines in the distance and gripped his rifle tighter. The above scenario reads like fiction, but many claim that it could have been true. In our book, George Patton, a captivating guide to a combative American war hero who played a critical part in the Battle of Normandy during World War II, we've dedicated an entire chapter to this topic. So, if you're curious to discover more about this, as well as more captivating stories and facts about George Patton, then make sure to check out the links in the description. If you liked the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.